The whole valley agreed Elspeth had bought her own ruin, 80 times over. She knelt in the dust of the auction yard, the heat shimmering off the packed earth, and laid down the last of her husband's money for a herd of pigs, so wretched they looked like they'd been stitched together from scraps of hide and hopelessness. They were razor-backed, their skin a cracked map of mange and filth, their eyes cloudy with a dullness that spoke of near starvation. 80 of them. Mr. Silas Croft, the grain dealer whose own hogs were round as barrels, let out a soft chuckle that carried across the quiet crowd. It was not a kind sound. A young woman alone, he said to the man beside him, just loud enough for her to hear, has a hard enough time. Ashamed to see her throw good money after bad bones, the other men murmured agreement. They saw a fool, a grieving widow making a desperate, witless choice. They saw 80 walking skeletons that would surely be dead by the first frost, taking her last dollars with them. What they did not yet know was that ruin sometimes wears a different face, and that value is a thing that hides in the places no one else bothers to look. They saw 80 problems. Elspeth, watching the way one scrawny sow still fought to shoulder the others away from an empty trough, saw 80 chances. She saw 80 hungry mouths, and she had the one thing in the valley that was free, a field choked, smothered, and conquered by what everyone else called poison. 6 months earlier, the silence in her small cabin had been the loudest thing in the world. After the fever took Thomas, the silence had weight and corners. It sat on the other chair and lay on the other side of the bed. Her inheritance was 30 acres of the worst land in the county, a steep, scrubby hillside that tumbled down to a creek. And the kudzu. It had come a generation ago, a government promise of erosion control, and had since become a relentless green tide. It swallowed fences, barns, and forgot about wagons. It climbed trees and smothered them, their dead gray branches reaching out of the living green like pleading hands. The land was considered worthless. Silas Croft had offered her a pittance for it, for the timber rights he said, but she knew he just wanted to add it to his holdings, to let it lie fallow and forgotten. She refused, not out of pride, but because a person needs a place to stand, even if that place is being eaten alive. She had spent the first months walking its edges, listening to the rustle of the vine's leaves, a sound like a constant, soft rain. It was the sound of being consumed. She had tried to fight it with a scythe, but for every vine she cut, 3 more seemed to surge forward in its place. The work was endless, and her hope was a dwindling currency. It was on one of these walks that she saw the auction notice tacked to the post office door. 80 head, swine, sold as is she knew the farm. It had failed 2 counties over, its owner broken by drought and debt. The pigs would be starving. And a thought, quiet and mad, began to take root in the back of her mind. A thought that connected the relentless hunger of the green vine with the desperate hunger of an animal. The walk home from the auction was a gauntlet of pity and scorn. No one offered to help her drive the pathetic herd. They were her mistake, her burden. The pigs shuffled and stumbled, a river of misery flowing down the dusty road toward the one place nobody wanted. They were too weak to run, too tired to bolt. It took her until dusk, her hands raw from wielding a guiding switch, her face caked in a mask of dust and sweat. As they turned onto her path, the pigs seemed to sense the change. They lifted their heads, their snouts twitching. They could smell the water in the creek, and they could smell the green. When she finally broke down the makeshift gate to their new pasture, a 5-acre patch she had fenced with salvaged wire and sheer stubbornness, they did not hesitate. They poured into the kudzu like water soaking into dry soil. For a moment, they stood motionless, hip-deep in the tangled vines. Then, one of them lowered its head and began to root. A second followed, and then a third, and soon the whole field was alive with the sound of tearing leaves and snapping stems, of vigorous, desperate chewing. Elspeth leaned against a fence post, her body aching, and watched them. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that made the kudzu look like a rolling sea. The town saw 80 mouths to feed. She saw 80 scythes, 80 plows, 80 tiny, determined engines of clearance. The arithmetic of her survival began to form in her mind, a fragile equation of vine against bone, of scorn against hope. She had made her bet. Now all she could do was wait and work. Her neighbor to the north was a man they called Old Man Hemlock. He wasn't old so much as timeless, with a face like a dried apple and hands that were permanently stained with the earth. He lived alone in a cabin that seemed to have grown out of the hillside, and he spoke in short, cryptic sentences that most people dismissed as nonsense. He had watched her drive the pigs past his property without a word, his eyes narrowed against the sun. The next morning, he appeared at her fence line while she was hauling buckets of water from the creek. He held a gnarled walking stick and simply stood there, observing the pigs as they tore into the kudzu with a frenzy that had not abated since their arrival. They were already transformed, their lethargy burned away by the sudden abundance. "Town says you bought a grave for your money," Hemlock said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. Elspeth didn't stop her work, just shifted the weight of the yoked buckets on her shoulders. "The town has a lot to say. They say that vine is poison," he continued, gesturing with his stick at the great green blanket covering her land. "Chokes the life out of everything. It seems to be feeding them just fine," she replied, her voice steady and plain. He watched her for another long moment, his gaze sharp and appraising. He wasn't mocking her. He was measuring her. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Poison's a matter of opinion. To a cow, that vine is a stomachache. To a goat, it's a feast. To the soil, it's a thief." He poked the ground with his stick. "People forget. The poison and the cure, they often grow from the same root." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving the aphorism hanging in the air. Elspeth stood and watched him go, the weight of the water digging into her shoulders. The poison and the cure. She looked at her field, at the pigs turning a liability into life, and for the first time since Thomas died, the silence in her heart felt a little less heavy. His words were a gift, a confirmation of the wild hope she was banking on. She had work to do. The pigs needed more than just vine. They needed clean water, a dry place to shelter, and a watchful eye. The labor was methodical, back-breaking, and constant. She rose before the sun, her hands quickly growing rough as bark. Day after day, she hauled water. Day after day, she mended the straining fences. She learned the quiet language of the herd, the sharp bark of alarm, the low grunt of contentment, the insistent squeal of a piglet separated from its mother. She gave names to the lead sows, Hester, Ruth, Constant, and they learned the sound of her voice, coming to the fence when she called. By June, the change was undeniable. The pigs were no longer skeletons. Their ribs had vanished beneath a growing layer of fat. Their hides, scoured by the dense foliage and constant rooting in the damp earth, began to clear. The angry red patches of mange faded, replaced by healthy pink skin sprouting coarse, clean bristles. They were becoming, improbably, beautiful. Their days fell into a rhythm. They would graze ferociously for hours, then sleep in great snoring piles in the shade of the few trees the kudzu hadn't yet killed. Elspeth practiced a kind of rotational grazing born of necessity. She would fence off a new acre of dense kudzu, and the pigs would descend upon it, eating the leaves, the tender shoots, and using their powerful snouts to dig up and devour the starchy, tuberous roots. In a week, they would have cleared it down to the bare red clay, tilling the soil as they went. Then she would move them to the next patch, leaving behind a field of overturned, fertilized earth. She kept her success like a coal banked low under ash, hidden and warm. When she went to town for supplies, she met the knowing smirks and condescending questions with a quiet stillness. "How are those poor creatures of yours, Elspeth?" Silas Croft would ask, his voice dripping with false concern. "Still breathing," she would reply, her expression unreadable. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The town continued to believe in her failure because it was the story they had already written. But a boy named Finn saw the truth. He was 10, the son of a sharecropper whose land bordered crofts, a whip-thin child with eyes that missed nothing. He started appearing at the edge of her property, sitting on a log for hours, just watching. He never said a word. Elspeth didn't chase him off. One day, she was wrestling a new roll of wire into place when he spoke for the first time. "That one," he said, pointing a skinny finger. "The one with the black spot. She's the boss." Elspeth looked at Hester, who was indeed watching the others with an air of absolute authority. "She is," Elspeth agreed. "Her name is Hester." From then on, Finn was a regular presence. He learned the names of the sows. He helped her spot weaknesses in the fence line. He never asked for anything. but she started leaving a biscuit and a small jar of milk for him on the fence post. He would eat it slowly, his eyes fixed on the pigs, a silent communion of outsiders. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, hot and breathless. The rest of the valley's pastures were turning brown and brittle. The corn in the fields was stunted, the leaves curling in on themselves. But Elspeth's land was an island of vigorous, almost violent green. The kudzu, with its deep roots, was impervious to the dry spell. It thrived in the heat, growing with an audible hiss and crackle in the quiet of the evening. Her pigs were now fat and sleek, their contentment a stark contrast to the anxiety settling over the valley. The arithmetic she did in her head at night was no longer about survival, but about surplus. 80 pigs, each gaining weight steadily, represented a fortune no one else could see. The first test of that fortune came in the form of a broken wagon wheel. A traveling butcher, a man named Abel who serviced the towns up and down the river, found himself stranded a mile from her farm. He came walking up her path, dusty and annoyed, looking for a horse to hire. His eyes fell on her herd, and he stopped dead. He stared for a long time, his professional gaze assessing the animals. He saw no ribs, no sign of sickness. He saw broad backs and heavy hams. He walked to the fence, making a low clicking sound with his tongue. Hester and Ruth trotted over, their snouts twitching with curiosity. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Elspeth, his tone stripped of all condescension. "These are fine-looking hogs. Where are you grazing them?" "Here," she said simply, gesturing to the kudzu. He blinked, looking from the pigs to the sea of green leaves and back again. He had heard the stories in town about the widow and her mangy herd. This was not what he had expected. "On the vine?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. They fattened on the vine. He was a practical man, and the evidence was right before his eyes. "I need a hog," he said. "My wagon is full of ice, and I'm losing time. I was meant to pick one up from Silas Croft, but is looking thin from the drought. Will you sell?" Elspeth met his gaze. This was the moment, the first turning point. The world outside her fence was about to weigh and measure her mad experiment. She named a fair price, the same price a prime hog would have fetched before the drought. Abel didn't haggle. He nodded, a glint of respect in his eyes. He was a man who knew quality when he saw it. They chose a young boar, and with an efficiency that was both brutal and graceful, he dispatched and dressed it right there. As he worked, he commented on the quality of the animal. "Look at that," he said, pointing with the tip of his knife. "The fat is clean white, not greasy, and the marbling in this loin. I haven't seen meat like this in years." He explained that the kudzu, rich in proteins and minerals, was producing pork that was leaner and more flavorful than corn-fed. It was, he declared, a miracle. When he was done, he paid her in crisp bills, stacking them neatly in her palm. "When I come back through in 2 weeks," he said, loading the carcass onto his repaired wagon, "I'll buy 5 more. Maybe 10. Don't you sell them to anyone else." It had worked. The secret she had banked like a coal was now glowing, ready to catch. The butcher's visit changed nothing and everything. He was an outsider, so his praise was dismissed in town as the rambling of a stranger. But the money in Elspeth's hand was real. It was solid proof. She bought more wire, a better axe, and a sack of flour that wasn't full of weevils. She bought a piece of hard candy for Finn, who accepted it with a rare, shy smile. The small victories were sweet, but she knew better than to celebrate. The sky remained a hard, cloudless blue. The creek shrank until it was just a muddy trickle. The dust from the road coated the kudzu leaves near the fence, but deeper in, the vine continued to flourish, a testament to its relentless, alien vitality. Whispers in town began to shift. The mockery lessened, replaced by a grudging, suspicious curiosity. How were her pigs still fat when theirs were lean? What devil's bargain had she struck with that cursed vine? Silas Croft watched her most closely. His own operation was suffering. The price of corn was skyrocketing, and his hogs were losing weight. He started riding by her property more often, his horse trotting along the fence line, his eyes scanning her herd. He saw abundance where he had predicted ruin, and his thin smile grew thinner. He saw her success not as a marvel, but as an affront. He could not comprehend how she, a woman alone with nothing, had managed what he, with all his resources, could not. He began to plant seeds of a different kind. He spoke of how the kudzu on her land was a menace, a threat to the whole valley. "It's creeping, you know," he'd say at the store. "That woman's negligence will be the ruin of us all." It was a lie. The kudzu had been everywhere for decades, but fear is a fertile ground for lies. People, watching their own crops wither, were starting to listen. They needed something to blame, and the strange woman with the fat pigs and the poison field was an easy target. The season turned toward autumn. The heat did not break. The first sign of the true crisis came when Finn's father, a proud, hard man named Jed, lost his entire bean crop. The kudzu, which had always stopped at the edge of his well-tended field, seemed to surge across the dividing line, smothering the plants in less than a week. He stood at the edge of his ruined field, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked across the road at Elspeth's land, at her thriving animals, and his fear curdled into blame. He was not alone. Field after field began to fail, not just from the drought, but from the kudzu's sudden, explosive advance. The unique conditions of that year, the wet spring that fed the roots, the brutal summer that killed its competitors, had turned the vine from a nuisance into a plague. It became the valley's waking nightmare, a silent green monster devouring their livelihoods. And it had all started, they told themselves, on the widow's land. The hunger began as a low hum of anxiety and quickly grew into a sharp, painful reality. The town's reserves were dwindling. Jed had to sell off his 2 milk cows for a fraction of their worth. Others followed. The generosity of neighbors frayed, replaced by the grim arithmetic of their own larders. How many mouths? How many days? The mockery that had been aimed at Elspeth now carried a jagged, dangerous edge. She was no longer just a fool. She was a threat. She was the witch on the hill whose dark magic thrived while their good, honest crops failed. She stayed on her property, mending her fences, tending her herd, feeling the shift in the valley's mood like a change in barometric pressure. She and Finn were her only regular companions. The boy would appear with news, his young face etched with worry. "Mr. Croft says you have to burn it," he reported one afternoon. "Says the vine is a pestilence and your pigs are carrying it. The pigs are eating it." Finn. Not carrying it. That's not what he's telling people. The confrontation she had been dreading came a few days later. Silas Croft rode up to her gate, not alone, but with Jed and 2 other grim-faced farmers. They sat on their horses, a small, unhappy posse, looking down at her where she stood by the fence. "Elspeth," Croft began, his voice smooth as oil on water. "We have a problem. You have a problem, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even. "My pigs are fine. This vine," he said, gesturing dramatically at her field, "is destroying the valley. It originates here, on your land. You have a responsibility to your neighbors. This vine was here long before I was," she countered. "And it's on your land, too," Jed spoke up, his voice cracking with emotion. "It took my beans, Elspeth. All of them. I'm sorry for that, Jed. But the vine didn't ask my permission." Croft held up a hand, silencing him. "A young woman alone cannot manage a plague like this. It's beyond you. For the good of the community, you must sell. I will give you a fair price for the land, to clear it properly. And I'll take the hogs off your hands. It's the only way to contain this." He named a price that was an insult, a fraction of what the land alone was worth, let alone the 80 prime hogs now rooting contentedly behind her. It was not an offer. It was a threat veiled in false concern. One woman alone. He kept saying it. He thought it was her weakness. He had no idea it was the source of her strength. She had been one woman alone when she'd fought the kudzu with a scythe, one woman alone when she'd hauled the water, one woman alone when she'd faced their ridicule. She was not afraid of being alone. She was afraid of what their hunger and fear would make them do. She looked past Croft at Jed's hollowed-out face, at the despair in the other men's eyes. She saw their pride, and she saw their terror. And in that moment, her own fear gave way to a cold, clear certainty. She knew what she had to do. She looked directly at Silas Croft, her gaze so steady it seemed to push him back in his saddle. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it had the weight of stone. "The land is not for sale, and the pigs are not for sale. Not to you." Croft's smooth facade cracked. A flicker of raw anger showed in his eyes. "You are being selfish, madam. Your neighbors are starving while you hoard your resources." "My resources," she said, letting the words hang in the air. "The ones you all called my ruin? The ones you laughed at?" She turned her attention to Jed. "Jed, Your field is ruined. The beans are gone, he flinched, but nodded, his jaw tight. What if I told you I could fix it? She asked. The men exchanged confused glances. What are you talking about? Jed demanded. My pigs, Elspeth said, her voice gaining strength. They are experts at clearing kudzu. They eat it, roots and all. Let me fence off your bean field and turn my herd into it for 2 weeks. They will clear every last vine. They will till the soil and fertilize it as they go. By spring, your field will be ready for a new planting, richer than it was before. Croft burst out laughing, a harsh, ugly sound. She is mad. She wants to infest your land with her diseased animals. But Jed was listening. He was a farmer. He understood soil and ruin and the promise of renewal. He looked at the red, overturned earth in Elspeth's pasture, and he looked at his own choked field. And what do you get out of it? He asked, his voice rough with suspicion. This was the moment for the arithmetic of generosity, not greed. You're hungry, Elspeth said simply. Your family is hungry. For the use of your field, I'll give you a full-grown hog, butchered and dressed. And the same for any other man who lets my herd clear his land. A stunned silence fell over the small group. A full-grown hog was a fortune. It was meat for the winter. It was survival. It was an offer of such shocking fairness that they didn't know how to react. They had come expecting to intimidate a foolish woman, and instead, they were being offered salvation. Croft saw the tide turning and tried to stop it. Don't listen to her. It's a trick. She'll ruin you. But his words sounded hollow now. They were the words of a man who offered only threats and low prices. Elspeth offered them food and a solution. Jed looked at his hands, then at Elspeth, and then at his ruined field. The fight went out of him, replaced by a desperate, dawning hope. All right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. All right, Elspeth, you can have the field. The next morning, Elspeth and Finn began the work. They dismantled a section of her fence and, using Jed's own posts, created a fenced corridor across the road to his ruined bean field. Jed came out to help, his movements stiff and awkward at first, but soon he was working with a quiet intensity. He did not apologize for his part in the mockery, and she did not ask him to. The work was its own apology. When the new enclosure was ready, Elspeth opened the gate. The herd, sensing fresh territory, poured across the road and into Jed's field with a chorus of eager grunts. They descended on the kudzu with the same focused intensity they showed every day, tearing and rooting and chewing. For the first time in months, Jed looked at his land and saw not a grave, but a promise. The news spread through the valley like fire in dry grass. A farmer would ride by, see the pigs working, see the hope on Jed's face, and ride away with a thoughtful expression. One by one, they came to her. First 2, then 4, then a dozen. Men who had laughed at her now stood at her gate, hats in hand, asking if her offer still stood. For each, she had the same answer. Yes. She kept a careful ledger, a new kind of arithmetic. So many acres of kudzu cleared, so many hogs pledged. She was turning the valley's plague into its cure, one field at a time. Finn became her second in command, a small, serious general directing the movement of their porcine army. He knew every pig, every path, every weak spot in a fence. He had found his purpose. Elspeth was no longer a woman alone. She was the center of a vast, communal effort of reclamation. The valley was being saved by the very things it had scorned: a stubborn woman, a herd of mangy pigs, and a poison vine. The work was hard, but it was filled with a purpose that warmed her to the bone. She was not just surviving. She was helping her community survive. The quiet satisfaction of it was better than any shouted vindication. Her triumph was not in being right, but in making things right. She had learned what Old Man Hemlock meant. The poison and the cure came from the same root, and sometimes it took a clear eye